You are watching Grassroots Community Television, helping you make television people watch everywhere. Broadcasting on cable channel 82 in Glenwood Springs and Carbondale, and channel 12 in Aspen, Snowmass, Basalt, and Elderbell. Free over-the-air broadcasts throughout the Roaring Fork Valley. All programs can be watched anytime, anywhere at grassrootstv.org.
I'm Dave Reed from the Wilderness Workshop. Welcome to tonight's Naturalist Nights. Naturalist Nights is a partnership between ACES and the Wilderness Workshop. Been working really well for 3 or 4 years now. ACES being your go-to source on environmental education, and the Wilderness Workshop is more of an advocacy group advocating on behalf of the public lands around our area. So a couple of housekeeping items. I want to let you know of upcoming shows. Next week, February 10th, we've got Phil Nyland of the White River National Forest. He was here last year talking about bat caves. This year he's going to talk about white-nosed bat syndrome, which is unfortunately a disease that's been striking bats around the country. And looking a little bit further ahead, because I really want you to get this on your calendars, on February 17th, Gasland, we're actually going to show a film here. It's not going to be a speaker, and that film has just been nominated for an Academy Award, and that's we'll have it right here on the screen, and that should be really good. That's about obviously the impacts of gas drilling in all over the country, including here in western Colorado. And one other thing to mention, for those of you who might live down Valley or want to go down Valley, tomorrow night, Nelson, our speaker tonight, is going to have an opening of his images, a gallery opening of his images in the 3rd Street Center in Carbondale, along with a showing of Dottie Fox's watercolors, the late Dottie Fox. Many of you will know her. So our speaker tonight, Nelson Guda, has sort of been mixing art and science all his life. He's got a PhD in ecology and in evolution. And for 7 years he ran a research institution at the University of Texas and still lives in Austin. But for the last 6 years he's been engaged in this project of documenting roadless areas. And he's got a slideshow based on that. So here he is.
Can we bring down the house lights? Yeah, thanks. area that's just directly over, almost directly over Paonia. The little lights in the background there on the right side of the screen are Paonia, Colorado. And the light in the foreground that you see is Elk Creek Coal Mine. And I did that time lapse this summer in the middle of June or middle of July. I'm going to read you something that's a journal entry of mine that I wrote when I was here. This is on the edge of the Reagan Mountains, just up the Crystal River, actually. I don't know how many minutes had passed. I was engrossed. Sitting cross-legged and looking at my journal, I was concentrating on the words I was crafting. Around me, the sky was slowly shifting from light to darker blue as the sun retreated westward, and aspen shadows were moving imperceptibly across the dust in the trail. The trail was lined with grasses heavy with pollen, and my eyes stung and watered. The only sounds were my allergic reactions to the grass, which hung like shouts over the valley that I was waiting to photograph at the end of the day. After a spell of silence, I looked up, and she was there, staring at me with coal-black eyes. The mountain lion crouched down as our eyes met, and the 10 feet of space between us pulled taut, filled with the tension of unknown outcomes. I couldn't tell for sure that she was female. A small male would have had the same stature. What was going through her head? How long had she been watching me? I had no idea. As we stared at each other, the only thing I knew for sure was that I was larger than she was, which wasn't much of a consolation at the moment. She stood immobile, crouched down and watching me, and I watched her. I've seen other big cats in the wild before looking into these deep black eyes, mostly jaguars in Central America. Only one of those encounters had unnerved me, and that was a female too. That time, the only thing I could see in her intent eyes was the bright green reflection of my headlamp. Now here I was facing down a female again. Mountain lions are notoriously unpredictable and statistically far more dangerous to people than jaguars. But for some unexplainable reason, I didn't feel threatened. She didn't move a muscle. I sat still, and we just stared into each other's eyes. My camera lay on the ground, a long arm's reach to my left. My heavy tripod a long reach to my right. Of all the cats in the wild I've seen, I've never photographed one. So after a brief debate, I reached for my camera, and it was over. The instant I moved, she rotated and disappeared around the bend in the trail behind her. I jumped up and looked around the trees to see if I could catch her going, but she had already gone, as silently and completely as she had appeared. The trail was dry and there weren't even any tracks. If I was a puma or a dog or most any other mammal, I probably would still smell her. But I couldn't, and it was suddenly as if she had never been there. There was only the sky, the trees, and my watering eyes. After a moment, I could hear my heart beating. The sun was lower now, so I put away my journal and started to set up my camera. The moment was over. So I was here. This is a roadless area that's right on the edge of the Reagan Mountains. And it's typical of a lot of what roadless areas are. Many of them are buffers and borders to important wilderness areas, but not all of them. Which brings up the question, what is wilderness? What is it? Why do we care about wilderness? What does it have to do with us? Why is it important to us? And what does this have to do with roadless areas, which are not wilderness areas, but they're a little bit different? This is Teddy Roosevelt, who really was one of the people that embedded the concept of wilderness being important, I think, in our national psyche. Part of that happening was his taking this trip to the Amazon and following the River of Doubt, which gained him a lot more notoriety for his views on wilderness. So in 1964, Congress created the Wilderness Act. And at that point, they defined what wilderness should be. This land that's been untouched by man and uncultivated. And basically, there's no marks of man in it. Inhospitable is one of the words they use. So why am I here from Texas talking to you people in Colorado about wilderness? There is no wilderness in Texas, I can tell you that now. And what are roadless areas? How does that relate to wilderness? Why should you care about it? And What does this have to do with your house? And I'll try to answer all those questions. Okay. My interest in roadless areas, lands without roads, came from working in Costa Rica for 6 years. I was doing research down there in the rainforest in a park called Corcovado National Park. That's the little peninsula that's down in the southwest corner of Costa Rica, and this is a bigger view of it. The whole part around that red dot is the park. And you can see a little road going around the end of the peninsula. Well, actually, the other side of the peninsula is all filled with roads. It's filled with logging roads. And the park itself doesn't have any roads at all. You can't drive in there. You can only fly or walk or boat in. So it's a beautiful place. And I noticed something while I was there, because I spent a lot of time outside the park also, which was that inside the park, where there are no roads, you have a lot more large mammals, you have a lot more birds that have difficulty with people, you have a lot more of the small mammals that don't do well around people. Partly that's because there's no hunting in the park, and there's quite a bit of hunting outside the park. It's not entirely the reason. Then when I came back to the US to live there permanently here, right at that time, the roadless rule had become an issue in the US. It had just been put out by the Clinton administration at the end of the Clinton administration, and this map came out, which was a map of the inventoried roadless areas in the US, this is from the National Forest Service. The red areas are roadless areas. They're what we call inventoried roadless areas. And most of them are in the west, as you can see. They're kind of scattered through the western states. There's a bunch in Alaska down in the bottom. There's even some little ones in the east, and then you can't even see it. Maybe you can kind of see, if you walk up to the screen, you see there's a couple specks in Texas, which is laughable. I've never been to them. But so how does this relate to wilderness? Because wilderness areas are different. They're not inventoried roadless areas. Inventoried roadless areas are not wilderness. But when Congress created the Wilderness Act in 1964, they then ordered the National Forest Service to inventory all of its lands and basically create an inventory of all the lands that were suitable for wilderness protection. This is before there was any wilderness areas. So the wilderness area just passed. There's maybe one or two at that point. And they wanted to know, okay, if we're going to create wilderness areas, what lands do we pick from, basically? So the Forest Service did that. They pulled out their maps, and they created this list of lands, and these are called the inventoried roadless lands, inventoried roadless areas. And that's what this is all about. So those areas pretty much languished for 30 years. That was in the early 1970s, and it was pretty much just a paperwork issue that the Forest Service had said these are roadless areas. They didn't do anything with them. Some of them became wilderness areas, but most of them did not. And so nothing happened until 2001. And in 2001, right at the end of the Clinton administration, the Forest Service published a rule, which they'd been working on for 2 years, which basically set aside all of those lands from road building. So they said, okay, all these lands, which are roadless now, you're not allowed to build roads on them except for extreme cases. And there's a few unusual cases that you're allowed to do that. Okay, so why is this a big deal? Who cares? You know, roads, whatever. Roads are kind of a big deal. This is an interesting statistic that I found a few years ago. In 2007, the US had over 4 million miles of public roads. That's enough to circle the Earth 156 times. That's a lot of roads. It's 20% of all the roads in the world. And we are not 20% of the land mass in the world. This is a great map that was created by a guy who was the head of the USGS in Colorado, actually. I think he was in Boulder. And what this is the distance, average distance from a road for any point in the US. If you look on the scale on the right, dark green is very far from a road, relatively, and then the yellow at the bottom is very close to a road. And if you zoom in, the most remote place that you can get in the lower 48, this doesn't count Alaska because you can get pretty far from a road in Alaska. Very different story. Okay, but in the lower 48, the farthest you can get from a road is 21 miles. That's all. as the crow flies. Of course, you know, it takes a long time to walk to that 21 miles. That's, if you can fly it, that's nice. And that's a little area that's in just at the corner of Yellowstone. That white box is Yellowstone, and it's in the bottom right corner, just outside in a wilderness area. And it's where they release all the problem bears from Yellowstone. So you read guidebooks about this, and there are these big warning signs. Do not hike here alone. I'm going to go there someday. And Colorado actually has a pretty decent number of places that are relatively far from roads. And you'll notice that the farthest you can get from a road in Colorado is down here in the Waimanich. And part of the reason for that is because the Waimanich is surrounded by inventoried roadless areas. Okay, so again, roads. What's the big deal? Roads have a lot of things that are associated with them. There's very good parts of them that we need for our society and our economy, obviously. You know, recreation, they're an important way to get into these places that we want to protect. You know, a lot of people aren't going to protect these places unless they can get in and use them. And to some degree, I understand that. But they also have a lot of negative impacts, and there's a lot of very well documented environmental impacts for roads. Erosion is a huge problem. They often destroy streams. They fragment the habitat in a very big way, and they bring in invasive species. There's many other things. And the roadless rule, when they went through it, they did a very rigorous scientific review of all of the ecological effects of roads. It was actually a pretty decent review, very good for a government rule. So the roadless rule went through 2 years of reworking and comment period, and they had over 4 million comments, which at that point might still be the case, was the most comments ever submitted for any federal rule in the history of our government. 95% of them were in favor of the rule. That was 60 million acres. 60 million acres is a lot of land, and most of it is what I would call virtually unknown. And the reason why it's unknown, it's not like it's unexplored or somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. Some of these places are very close. But it's land that people don't know about because there's no signs that say this is something another roadless area. There's no maps to them. They're just Forest Service land. So I decided that I wanted to document these places so that people would understand what they are, and trying to raise some public awareness about them. And the reason why I wanted to do that was because right after the roadless rule came out, then the administration changed, and the incoming administration, the Bush administration, started to do a lot of things to try and dismantle the roadless rule. And they took many tacks to do that, and there's still court battles going on about that to this day, 10 years later. So, okay, setting out to photograph 60 million acres of land was probably not the wisest thing I've ever done in my life. Were I to go back and do that again, I'm not sure that that necessarily would have been my first choice, but I ended up doing it. And so I've photographed more or less where all those stars are, more since I've done this map, actually. But still, I couldn't go everywhere, and so I enlisted a few photographers to help me out, and some other photographers contributed to the project as well. And I just want to really quickly run through some photographs from these lands, from where some of those stars are, just to give you an idea of what they are and what the diversity of these lands are, because it's an amazingly diverse set of lands. And they're really beautiful. And actually, would you mind turning off this light while we go through these, because they'd be good to be able to see these pictures. Okay. So this is the Mallard-Larkins Roadless Area in northern Idaho. Gorgeous, rolling low mountains with untouched, very diverse forest. This is the Siskiyou Roadless Area in southwest Oregon. It surrounds the Siskiyou Wilderness Area. This is one of those roadless areas that's a buffer land around an important wilderness area. This is the Dark Divide Roadless Area in southwest Washington. This could stand on its own as a wilderness area. It's very large. It has some of the last remaining uncut rainforest in southwest Washington. Some of the last large stands of rainforest on the west coast, actually. That's Mount St. Helens in the background. That's some of the rainforest in the Dark Divide. This is the Apache Kid Roadless Area in central New Mexico. This is a desert sky island. So it contains, I'm standing on a sky island here and looking across the desert. I have the foothills of another sky island, and both of those are roadless areas. This is Highlight Canyon Roadless Area in south central Montana. It's just a little teeny bit south of Bozeman. Absolutely gorgeous valley. You can hike up that valley. You can get to this trailhead 20 minutes from downtown Bozeman. It's a 7-mile or 11-mile hike up to this point, which is the top of this valley, this glacial moraine valley. You go by 7 incredible waterfalls on the way up there. And then this is the very tip of a massive roadless area that connects all the way to Yellowstone. It's considered an extremely important part of the greater Yellowstone ecological system. This is Meadow Creek Roadless Area in central Idaho. Unbelievably beautiful, massive western red cedar forests. There's not very many of those left. This is the Tongass Roadless Area in southeast Alaska. I had to kayak in there because it's an island and there's no roads there. There's nothing there. Well, actually, one half of the island has been clear cut. This is a look inside that rainforest. It's pretty stunning rainforest. It's really beautiful. It's very, very wet all the time. It's North Fork Smith River Roadless Area. North Fork of the Smith River is one of the few really clean, undammed rivers left on the west coast. It's beautiful. It still has healthy salmon populations. This is just around the corner in the Raggeds Roadless Area, which kind of wraps around the Raggeds Wilderness. Again, it's another one of those buffer roadless areas. This is in the southwest part of Colorado. It's the Hermosa Creek Roadless Area. This is looking at Kennebec Pass, looking south toward the La Plata Mountains. And Hermosa Creek Roadless Area is fantastic. If any of you have the chance, you should go down there and check it out. It's one of the few unprotected, unspoiled, entire watersheds in Colorado. It's beautiful. It's great mountain biking too. This is looking the other direction. There's always this quandary when you take a bunch of photographs and you have several that are beautiful and of the same area of which to use. And that last photograph was up on that ridge looking back this way. This is just south of here. It's in the Elk Mountains Collegiate Roadless Area. It's just north of Crested Butte. If you just drive north of Crested Butte, you'll see this. And this photograph is now hanging on the wall of Secretary Vilsack in D.C. as a group of conservation leaders gave this photograph to him 2 years ago when I was in D.C. That's me. So most of these places I have to hike into and stay a night or two. When I started this, I had these visions of spending months out in the wilderness and photographing. Is totally not the way it was because there's too many places to go. So mostly I hike in and hike out. You know, do hike in, spend a night in, maybe 2 nights in, and then hike out. Very quick, short trips into places, and it's exhausting. This was me waiting out a storm in Kennebec Pass. So why am I here in Aspen? Other than to just tell you about roadless areas in general, I wanted you to know something about roadless areas in Colorado and what I was doing in Colorado this past summer in 2010. So this is a map of Colorado roadless areas. And all these bright green areas are inventoried roadless areas. The grayish areas are national forest areas that are unprotected, and it's hard to see. There's this cross-hatched area. It's a little bit darker. Those are actual wilderness areas, which are protected with a wilderness status. So as you can see, there's a lot. And a lot of the land that probably many of you and many people take for granted as having some sort of protection of the level of wilderness or park or something is not protected. It's simply inventoried roadless area. The only protection is the roadless rule, which is in court. So this summer I was here to photograph an area called the Clear Fork Divide, which is basically most of the forests west of Carbondale, between Carbondale and Grand Junction, and a teeny little place called the HD Mountains, which are down east of Durango. And I'll tell you in a minute why I was photographing those. But first let me show you a photograph of one of those places. This is where that first time lapse was from. This is Buck Mesa, Gunnison National Forest. And I'm sorry, could you flick the light off again for a second? I know you're trying to film me. But to me, this really exemplifies what it is that's difficult to capture about these places. This is a beautiful photograph. I'm saying that myself as my photograph, but I think it's a beautiful photograph. But the lighting is beautiful. It's like a beautiful time of day. But this is not one of those places that you go and immediately look at and think that it's a spectacular landscape. Because compared to some other places, Long's Peak, the Holy Cross Wilderness, places with very high alpine scenery, it doesn't have the same kind of massive geological features. It does not jump out at you as being something that maybe people would make a national park around or a wilderness area around. It doesn't have that sort of classical scenic value. But it has a very quiet beauty and a really important ecological, a lot of ecological issues around it. I guess you can turn the light back on me. One of the things is what you're looking at there is one of the largest living creatures on the planet. That aspen forest has been in the running for one of the largest living creatures. There's two of them. This one that's up on Buck Mesa, mostly beyond this photograph actually, but the same forest extends into the photograph. And then the one just up in Kebler Pass, going over to Crested Butte. Those are two aspen forests that some scientists have determined are all one individual because aspen root underground and send up new trees, and so it can be all one large individual. And there's a lot of debate about what the largest creature in the world is, but many scientists would say that the largest living creature on Earth is an aspen forest, and this is one of the candidates. And I know you're shaking your head. There's many other candidates.
There's only one bigger than that.
There's a fungus.
Yep.
But that's still a debate. But there's something about these forests also that's really important. Other than you can take a beautiful photograph of it, these forests are mid-elevation forests. They are not scenic because they're not the high elevations, but they're important because they're not the high elevations. These are places the elk go in the winter. These are places where a lot of animals that can't live in high elevations live here. This is a really important ecological bridge between the high elevation wilderness areas like the Ragged Mountains. This is just west or east of here is the Ragged Mountains, and the desert. So if you think about climate change causing species to adapt and have to move upward, this is an important area for a long-term adaptation. Okay. Yeah, that's an active coal mine methane vent in Gunnison National Forest. That is not on a roadless area, but that is the type of development that's being proposed for Buck Mesa. The reason is because there's a coal mine right at the bottom of Buck Mesa, and there's a lot of coal underneath it. So that roadless area has already been leased for a coal mine expansion. And it's not strip mining. Okay, this is not a strip mine. This is a 1 acre pad that has a methane vent on it. But there's a lot that goes along with developing that infrastructure. Okay, the reason why this is happening is because these two areas, the Clear Fork Divide and the HG Mountains, sit on top of some fairly significant coal reserves and also coal bed methane and methane reserves. So the reason why I was in Colorado this summer and photographing these places in the Clear Fork Divide and the HG Mountains is because all of those places have been leased by the Forest Service for either coal or gas development. And there's some question about that leasing and whether it was appropriate at the time. And there's some legal battles around it. I personally don't think those lands should be leased. What happened with the Colorado roadless areas was that the national rule came out and the Bush administration proposed a rule that states could create their own roadless rules. And 2 states did. Idaho was one, Colorado was the other. Idaho came up with a roadless rule, which is not as strict as national rule, but not too bad. Colorado came up with a roadless rule which exempted many of the original roadless areas, and many of the exemptions were for energy development. So this is a big conflict right now about what to do with the Colorado State roadless rule. Wilderness Workshop has worked in the past with trying to get signatures to overturn that state rule, and it's still unclear what's going to happen with it. So here I'm going to give you a few pictures of what that type of development could look like on those lands. This is, it's not a methane vent, it's just a fresh air vent for the coal mine, for the Elk Oxbow coal mine. This is actually just down a little bit from Buck Mesa. This is another one of those methane vents, and that's the machinery that goes over top of it that actually vents the methane out. That's what that noise was. They're pretty noisy. Now I've talked with a lot of Forest Service people who do this leasing. This is not on a roadless area, it's on just national forest land that has no protection. And these guys, they're good guys. They want to work with the companies and make this development happen in the least intrusive way, and they work really hard at it, and for what they have to work with, they do a good job. However, what they have to work with is often a problem. And so these vents, you cannot decide where they're going to be placed based on the surface topography, because they have to be placed at certain intervals in the mine, and the mine shafts are made based on the underground topography. So if that vent happens to come up on the side of a steep hill like this one, well, then you just have to clear a pad on that steep hill. And if that creates a lot of erosion, well, that's unfortunate, because the vent has to go there. You can see a little bit of that. This is, so if you go over the pass towards Paonia, we flew over that area, and you can see some of those cuts where they put the methane vents in. They're fairly dramatic. So they say, when they'll talk about it, they'll say, well, the pads are only an acre, maybe 2 acres, and we just have roads to get to them. But it's actually, it's much more disruption than simply a 1 acre pad. In the HD Mountains down by Durango and in Battlement Mesa, this is the Battlement Mesa roadless area. It's just south of Battlement Mesa. And it's beautiful, actually. It's a gorgeous area. A little bit difficult to get up into. You have to get up in there from the backside. And in Thompson Divide, which you all know where that is probably, it's just west of Carbondale. All these places have been leased for gas development, natural gas development. And so this is some of what you might expect to see on this. These are methane mines. And these pads are small. These are fracking trailers. Again, let me back up really quick. And you might ask why I present these photographs in this style. It's a mixture of black and white and color. For me, this is an artistic decision because it just emotionally, to me, represents how that land feels when it's been developed. It feels very different to me than the wilderness. So these fracking trailers, this is an issue. Okay, again, the methane vents, or the methane wells where they're drilling for natural gas are different than the methane vents for coal mines. They don't have to place them at any, they can place them in a place where it's good to put a pad. Okay, so they don't have to put them on the side of a steep hill. And the pads are generally only an acre. But a really big issue is that the technique that they need to use to get the gas out from here is called fracking. I don't know if you've heard of this. That's what this documentary, Gasland, is about. I encourage you all to go see it. This just came out last week, this article in the New York Times, about how the EPA basically is bringing up this issue that a lot of the companies that have been doing fracking have been using diesel, which they're not supposed to do. Now, what fracking does, hydraulic fracturing is what it's called technically. They drill a very deep well, sometimes a couple thousand feet, and then they use high pressure water with chemicals in it to break apart the rock underneath the ground. because the methane is actually held in small spaces in the rock. So they can't just drill down and have the methane come up. So they drill down, shoot a bunch of water and chemicals down there, very high pressures, and it blasts apart the rock. And then the methane comes up. Well, the problem is to do that and to get the methane to come up cleanly, they need to use a number of chemicals which help break the rock and help keep it porous so the methane can flow back up through the shaft. And those chemicals are mostly all petroleum distillates. Okay, so they're not supposed to use diesel. Diesel's bad. Well, they use a lot of other things that are bad too. They use kerosene and turpentine and a number of other petroleum distillates. And what the movie Gasland talks about is how, although the companies that do this say that there's no way that that material will ever come back up to the groundwater, because generally they're drilling below the groundwater, there's now a lot of documented cases where they're finding benzene and various petroleum-related distillates coming up in people's groundwater, and people's groundwater supplies being completely destroyed. So this is a very important issue, because places that they're drilling have very clean water like this. This is in the Thompson Divide. You know, and this water is important habitat for trout around here. It's drinking water for many people. On the other side of the divide here, it's agricultural water for the North Fork Valley, which is a gigantic agriculture valley. I see that as being a fairly important issue. I told you I was going to say how this relates to you and your house. This is a refinery I passed in Salt Lake City this winter. I just had to turn around and go back and take a picture of it because it's just it was like a scene from Dante's Inferno or something. And it's horrific, but you know, this is what we live off of. We live these lives of great energy consumption. And I'm not an exemption to that. I mean, particularly on this project, I've driven all around the country. I've driven thousands and thousands and thousands of miles, wasted tons of gasoline to photograph these places. It's an irony. But you know, this is our life. We rely on this. Everything that we do relies on this. And where the energy comes to power our house comes from things like those natural gas wells. So it is an issue that is related to every one of us in some aspect. And I think it's worth thinking about. Okay, now, I don't want to leave you thinking all bummed out about this or anything, because actually 95% of the roadless areas around the country are still intact. And since the roadless rule has been passed, there's been very few incursions or development on those areas. The Colorado is a little bit of an exception, but actually those areas that have been leased, most of them have not been developed yet. There's only just, I think, 2 really bad developments that have happened on roadless areas. One is in Idaho, where they approved a phosphate mine expansion. I don't remember, the other one I think was in Oregon. So I'm going to just show you just a few more photos of some roadless areas. This is Columbine Roadless Area, northern New Mexico. This is, again, the Tongass in southeast Alaska. This is actually, okay, this is really cool, I have to tell you. This is this little ridge that was like 2 feet wide, and there's a stream coming down on this side that you can't see, like right in front of that. And then there's that waterfall on the other side, which came down the stream and ran on the other side of that ridge. It's really cool. And I spent a long time photographing that. And there were these gigantic grizzly bear tracks there. And this guy had brought me in on a boat. And while I was photographing, his dogs, which had come off the boat and were running around, started going nuts and just barking like crazy. And I kept photographing for a while, and then finally I went back to the boat, and everybody else was in the boat. And the dogs were in the boat too. And I got on the boat, and I was like, did that mean what I think it meant? Like, yep, we should go. This is from, I'm not always trying to capture just landscapes. Sometimes it's just the subtle, quiet, small beauty of these places. This is from Northwest Oregon off the Columbia River. This is an astonishing place in southern Idaho in the Pioneer Mountains, Surprise Valley. This could rival parts of Yellowstone. It's beautiful. And now I'm going to read one more thing for you. I can read it off here. This is one more little journal entry I have. And I'm going to show you something after that real quick. Time lapse that relates to this. Her hair brushed across, the night woke me. Her hair brushed across my face and I fell from her embrace into her presence. I blinked. It was almost midnight. I unzipped my tent and crawled out. I hadn't needed the tent. The clouds were gone. The ground was dry and hard, and I stumbled as though the earth below my feet had swayed gently. The meadow, cold and silent, was drifting through space. The pines around the edge were the end of the earth, and as I stood watching, a star shot past and disappeared behind them. I looked around and saw the Milky Way rising overhead, shooting skyward from one large tree at the edge of the clearing. And I realized that this was what she had woken me for, to see her tapestry spread out above the meadow across an unimaginable stretch of millennia, a million dreams laughing and crying in silence. And here was this little clearing floating among them in the long flowing locks of night. Hours went by as the hard ground tilted slowly through the night sky, and we watched each other until finally she was swallowed up by the rush of morning. Could you get the lights one more time? Thank you. So, yeah, questions?
So I know there are different categories of roadless areas. Do you see any actual physical implications of those different categories, or do you not think they really matter?
That's a really complicated question because there were different categories of roadless areas, but the roadless rule treats them all the same. So as the roadless rule goes, they're all the same. And, you know, I don't think I saw, I was aware of the categories when I was out there, but I don't think I really saw any dramatic differences. There's just so much variety to begin with. Roadless areas go from things that are as large as some large wilderness areas and equally untouched to places that are just narrow, teeny little strips of land along the edge of wilderness areas or parks. So it's really a vast and diverse set of lands. Yeah.
I guess my question is along those lines. When these inventory roadless areas were first documented,
Mm-hmm.
how big is the roadless? How do you categorize a land as being roadless? Does it have to be a distance from the road or a certain amount of?
It doesn't have to be a certain distance from road because some of the roadless areas will start at a road boundary. And they're the buffer between that road and a wilderness area. And technically, they were supposed to be 5,000 acres or more. But that also is complicated because it depends on how you define the tract. You know, because some of the tracts are actually, you could see them as split pieces that are actually smaller than 5,000 acres. Part of the issue was that when the Forest Service inventoried its lands back in the 70s, you know, they inventoried all these lands, and it probably wasn't the most thorough inventory. There are some states that are still complaining that they have lands that should have been in the inventory and never were. And then when the roadless rule became a rule, they actually just took that inventory as it was, and they didn't go back and re-inventory it, which, you know, honestly I think was a big problem because it included some lands that could have been left out because maybe some things had happened to them in the meantime, and it excluded some lands that should have been included. But it was, I think, it was the most significant conservation-based rule that the federal government has put forward since the Wilderness Act. Personally, that's my opinion. But very few people know about it. And the reason people don't know about these places is because there's no signs. There's not one sign out anywhere in the country that says, welcome to the Mallard Larkins Roadless Area, or whatever, any roadless area. There's no signs anywhere, and there's no maps. You can't go to a Forest Service office and say, hey, give me a map to go visit the roadless areas. They'll just look at you, and some of them won't even know what you're talking about, honestly. Yeah. There's a woman who, I don't know if it's out yet, but she's publishing a guidebook to roadless areas of Colorado. And I haven't seen it yet, but there are a lot of trails. And probably a lot of them are trails that you're all familiar with, but you're just not aware that they're in roadless areas. Yeah.
Not correct about this, but when the Wilderness Act was passed, the other land management agencies were also conducting inventory land eligible for wilderness status, correct?
I think so, but I'm not 100% sure about that. They didn't end up with the same set of lands that were defined as such. I know actually that the BLM has a set of lands that can be considered like roadless areas, but they're not bureaucratically the same. They're just lands that they know have no roads in them. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's actually been something a bunch of people who are involved with conservation have asked me, okay, one of the maps that was on there was from a website that I created. Part of this project was building a website that maps all the roadless areas in the US. It was a ridiculous project. but it's out there. It's called roadlessland.org. If you want to find these places, you can go there and you can zoom in and see topographical maps, terrain maps. It's all on top of Google Maps, so you can even get directions on how to get to places. And I made that for you guys to find these places. So people have come and complained to me and said, why don't you put the BLM lands in there? Well, it's a lot of work. Did you have a question?
Yeah, kind of a follow-up comment to you, Adam. Ken Salazar right now is trying to urge the BLM to review all of their areas that have potential wilderness destinations. And they have a lot like that.
Oh, yeah.
That brings me to my question about if you have been to Washington trying to do advocacy now, working with conservation. Can you kind of update us here? What is the status of some of these court battles?
I might not be the best person to update you on the court battle status. Dave might be better at that. I have been to Washington a number of times. In fact, a lot of these photographs were shown in the Senate building in D.C. Right when the administration changed last. I had an exhibit in the Senate building. So I've been to D.C. a number of times, but do you know much about what's up with the court cases right now? That there's a big court case in the 10th Circuit that was supposed to be decided this fall, and it's just in stasis.
Waiting.
Yeah.
The best person to comment is not here to your heart or staff during these big meetings tonight. So whatever I know is back to the beginning, so that's here with the partition. But yeah, he participates in weekly calls nationwide on this. They're waiting and waiting for this 10th Circuit decision to come down. But that's not, I mean, there's two different circuit courts that are kind of competing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even on which one is correct. But we are expecting that in months, let's say.
Yeah, and even with the 10th Circuit case, if the roadless rule comes out on top, basically survives that, that's not the end game yet. It's not the end of the game. Because the roadless rule itself was a Forest Service rule, was not a congressional action. It wasn't legislature. So until it's legislated, it's going to be easy to pick it apart.
And there is some talk about that. It's not going to happen in this Congress. But before the election, they were saying, oh, yeah, it'd be great if Congress could actually agree on a law that
Any other questions?
How many years?
There's one back there.
Can
Would you recommend, if you were in charge, would you take all these building stands and point blank make them wilderness?
Make them wilderness. That's a totally different question. The roadless rule is not wilderness.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
And I think no, I would not. You know, there's definitely lands out there in the roadless rule that are very worthwhile making wilderness, and a lot of them are most of them are important to have under the roadless rule. But wilderness, you know, wilderness status is a very different thing, and I don't think necessarily that all of these lands should fall under the Wilderness Act.
Maybe I should add something since I work for the Wilderness Workshop. Yeah, nobody would say that they should all be wilderness. You know, locally, you know, since our sort of service area is the White River National Forest, we started with roadless areas as the wider pool from which to decide what to make wilderness. And right off the top, we started with 1.1 million acres. Right off the top, we eliminated about 400,000 of those acres. And then for political reasons, it came down even further to about 350,000 acres. Because, yeah, it may be roadless, but if it has a lot of historic ATV or dirt bike use, it's not going to be wilderness, not going to be appropriate.
It's complicated. I mean, there are a lot of amazing and beautiful lands out there under the roadless rule, and it's, I think, definitely having them all set aside from road building is a great first step.
Yeah, and if we knew that we had a roadless rule that we could rely on permanently, then wilderness designation wouldn't be so important, because we'd have this other designation that does a pretty darn good job. Unfortunately, we don't have that reliance.
And actually, that's something that's caused a lot of controversy, that a lot of the conservative groups, particularly ATV groups, have come out against the roadless rule because they think that it's going to limit their access. In fact, the roadless rule says nothing about ATVs. So there's a lot of roadless areas that have trails that ATVs can use, and that's not part of the rule. It's just, I mean, personally, I would rather it was part of the rule, but it's not. You know, I'm not a big ATV fan. But that's part of the issue, is that this is an in-between status. You know, it's not as heavy as wilderness status, but it's very important. You got a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so most of this was about the lower 48 as well. I didn't see one Congress shot in there. And so a little bit about Alaska, and most of what I get from this conversation is that it's pretty much, you know, energy pushing into where they want to go, and roads is what gets them there.
Well, in Colorado. In Colorado, the issue is energy. It's not the issue everywhere.
Okay, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in the up north in Alaska, you know, near Prudhoe Bay and that area that has been sort of very controversial in terms of, you know, oil development. And now, is that a wilderness? Is it a wilderness area now?
North slope of Alaska?
No.
Or well, parts.
North slope?
Yeah, parts of it.
Oh, it's complicated. There's Alaskan.
Not the part you're referring to.
Yeah, no, that part's not. There's a petroleum refuge.
Wildlife refuge.
Wildlife refuge.
It's a wildlife refuge. And you know, now that we're looking at, you know, $100 barrel of oil is going to the Middle East, I mean, it looks like, you know, the price of oil is going that way pretty fast, and the truck is going to be coming on no matter who's in the White House, it seems like. So I guess my question is, you know, as an overall strategy, whether we're in Colorado or we're in Alaska, and the Wilderness Workshop really is, you know, taking the lead on this, I would go as far as to say national, since we're located in a hotbed of gas development. You know, is there a recommendation that you could make for us in terms of, you know, how do we balance, like you pointed out, the need, we all live on all of this energy that we're, you know, consuming on the one hand, on the other
You know, it's such a difficult question. I think I struggle with it as much as anybody does. But it's a grayscale, right? It's not black and white. Energy development, there's the oil and gas that has been easy to get, which we've gotten with fairly little damage to the environment, relatively. Yes, there's been massive damage in some places, but we're pretty much moved out of that era now, and we're moving into places that are going to require more and more dangerous access to get the energy, or places that have more potential for environmental damage, or techniques that have more potential for environmental damage, like hydraulic fracturing. You can't get that methane out unless you frack it out. Okay, so there comes this point at which we have to decide, well, what are we willing to give up in order to get this energy? And at this point, unfortunately, you know, there's not a whole lot of great alternatives. So the alternatives are we conserve, use less. That's a very important alternative. That's the most important alternative, I'd say. And then we develop new energy sources that are more renewable. That's another important one. Unfortunately, the government hasn't put enough funds, really, I think, into developing those new technologies. So it's, when you look at the big picture, it's very complicated. I think, personally, it has to be pushed forward on a lot of fronts. But the reason why I brought it back to a personal level is there is a personal level that we can all do. We can all try and conserve. That's easy. You know, it's a lot easier than you would think it would be.
Maybe one more question? Anybody? No? All right, well then let's give you a hand. Nelson. Thanks, Nelson, for coming from Austin and for having traveled so much in the last 6 years.